Raise 'em Up podcast brought to you by the New Mexico Boys and Girls Ranches. As always, I'm Heath Cull. Hope you're having a good day. It's been a little crazy around here. We are in the midst of a global pandemic that has caused significant restrictions to how we do things. And we're out at the ranch, so it's not that big a deal. But one of the things that has been kind of painfully obvious is that everybody kind of deals with this differently. Every family deals with it differently. Every group deals with it differently. And sometimes when we look at politics, we see these divisions that create these camps that can no longer get along, or that don't even speak to each other, really. They just yell at each other relentlessly, trying to be right. And it got me thinking about families, and sometimes our families get like this. There's this underlying tension about how this family or this part of the family or these cousins or this grandparent does things that create kind of this underlying resentment for that person, or kind of a that's just how he is or that's just how she is mentality towards certain members of the family. And kids start to kind of look at that and say, oh, we don't have to deal with people we don't like. We can just stop the conversation and just kind of avoid that. Most of the adults I talk to think that is in some way noble and a necessary way of kind of setting a boundary. That's actually an interesting way to put it, is setting a boundary, because a boundary actually is saying that, this is how we want things to happen, and then having a set of responses for what happens if it doesn't work out that way. But a lot of families are trying to figure out how to deal with the differences that exist in their own family. So you have different eating habits, you have different health habits. I know the consumption of sugar or artificial sweeteners or dyes or meat or gluten all create these rifts in families where they stop trying to understand where the other person's coming from. They just, okay, you're like that and we don't deal with that. That can get complicated for kids because they're basically playing off of the adults in their life. And then when they get to a certain age, they start saying, I'm going to do the same thing with the people in my life. I'm just not going to talk to this person, or I'm going to isolate this person, or we can't get along because of. That doesn't really lead us to having a diversity of thought in our lives. Having people around us that are capable and strong enough to disagree with us without it having to end the relationship is really an important factor. And kids don't really crave that unless they are taught by their parents to see it as valuable. And so right now you can pick any topic you want, and you can find a lot of different opinions about those topics, and you can find a lot of division and tension around those topics in families. We used to call my parents' house granny land when I was growing up, or when my kids were growing up, because the rules didn't seem to apply in granny land. They could do whatever they wanted. And it's a minor frustration that can become a bigger frustration. We had to explain to our kids, and we had to define it, and we had to set aside some time to discuss and say, we're not going to give you a list of rules that you have to tape on your shirt everywhere you go and then make everybody in the world comply with those things. But these are the rules when we're here. And then when you go to Grandma and Grandpa's house, or Pops and Granny's house, or Mimi and Papa's house, or whatever the terminology is, there may be a different set of rules, and you can navigate that if you're willing to just kind of discuss it and be okay with it. So I'm sure bedtimes were a lot different growing up when my kids were at someone else's house, particularly their grandparents, and that's okay. And the diets were different and structure was different. Talking about it is what makes that okay. Just ignoring it or letting it build up into resentment, that resentment and contempt that you hold for people that are different than you, that's like drinking poison and waiting for them to die. It just doesn't work out that way. We are not good enough actors to be able to convince our kids of how we wish we felt. They're going to see how we feel. They're going to see how we respond to things. They're going to look at our facial expressions. They're going to look at what we affirm and what we don't affirm. And they're going to make determinations about how we feel about those things. And it comes down to this simple pattern that you have to recognize: is there's an event that happens. Everything is an event that happens. And then we, in our head, build a story around that event. So if a kid is 17 years old and comes home late one night, the event is them not being home on time. The story that is often told in parents' heads is they're probably got drunk and are on the side of the road dying. They're probably a car crash. Very rarely are parents like, you know what, I bet they just lost track of time. I've done it before. I'm sure when they get home, we can have a lovely conversation about it and it'll be fine. That would be helpful, but that's just not how it works. I don't work that way. I'm always assuming the worst too. But that building that story sometimes is what we do to people. So we see that our parents are not honoring the structure when our kids are over there. And so we say, oh, well, of course, they just want everything to be popular at their house. So they're not going to set any rules and they make us be the bad guy. That's building a story around an event. They just went to bed late at somebody else's house. And you can influence that narrative by actually having the conversation, actually talking through it. And this goes with anything. When my kids were growing up, they would ask me about political events, and I would try really hard to give both sides of the story. And the reason I could do that is because, first of all, I wanted to know both sides of the story, and second of all, I had friends in my life that had the other side of the story that they saw differently, and I was willing to talk with them. And then I could present that to my kids, and then as they grew up, they started to form opinions, and they started asking the more difficult questions, like, what do you think? And then they formed their opinions about political issues, and their stances on things were formed by hearing both sides and then getting to decide. There's nothing worse for a child than feeling like everybody's trying to indoctrinate you. And this goes to politics, but it also goes to other family members or the way other people do things or how other people function. So you don't have to say we're going to function the way that other person functions in order to make peace. You can say we're going to be different. And kids can understand that the rules are this when we're here and that when we're there. And they can see, whether we like to admit it or not, our immediate emotional response whenever we see something that is different than what we do. They can see it all over our face. We cannot hide it. Then we sometimes make it a lot worse by lying to them and just saying, oh, no, I'm okay with other people, or, just be honest. That's what the one thing about being a parent that is so critical is to just be honest. If you don't know something, if you don't understand why one group of people feels a certain way about a certain thing, you can go find out. Or you can tell your kid, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And you can go do some research and hang out with some people that are different than you and ask some questions. And you don't have to agree. I don't necessarily agree with some of the ways people are lashing out in society against things that they find horrible. I can tell you, I find some of the same things horrible, but I can disagree with the lashing out part while also understanding how people get so fed up with an issue that they lash out. I was raised at the ranch. It's a bit of a broken system all the time. And the reason I say that is because I don't think anybody comes into this work trying to be broken, but you're navigating a family structure for kids that aren't yours, and people leave the job and new people come in. Well, when I was growing up, the priority was always significantly placed on validating adults, and that kids just needed to have some discipline in their life in order to be better citizens or better kids. Well, as time went by, things changed, and we start saying, okay, it's time to disrupt that system. It's time to take a look at that system. I still believe that adults hold the responsibility of being an authority, and I also believe that kids have a lot going on in their head, and a lot of times haven't had anybody help them learn how to express it. And what we know now is that a lot of times behaviors, the worst behaviors, the most negative behaviors, are sourced out of kids' traumatic events, adverse childhood events, trauma-based stuff. And so they get into situations where it's very difficult and they react badly because they're reacting out of a position of being having to relive a traumatic event. And then the adults can either start trying to figuratively crucify the child, discipline them, get them back under control, or an adult can say, you know what, this isn't really about me. I'm going to stand here and I'm going to listen and I'm going to let this traumatic event play itself out. I'm going to be supportive and I'm going to not take anything personally. I'm going to make sure it's not about me, and then we're going to get to the other side. And hopefully at some point, both of us can talk to the other person in a rational and reasonable way about what we thought of that situation. Teaching kids how to do that is critical, and a lot of parents do, and kudos to them. Some parents don't, and that's where some of the work needs to be done. Kids can handle a lot, but one of the things they don't handle well is kind of this emotional solitude, or this intellectual solitude, where whenever things get difficult, whenever things get challenging, whenever things get kind of out of whack, they're left alone. Go to your room, think about it. I can't deal with you right now. Those are all things that leave a kid in a state of solitude that's difficult. Well, if you let that go long enough, anger starts to build, resentment starts to build, and then you see a lashing out. People, regardless of their age, get to a point, and I apologize for this, but where they just don't give a damn. And so they lash out, and they don't care who it hurts because they're hurting so bad. And I think it's important to figure out better strategies as parents to get our kids to the point where when they're in that place and they start to feel that way, that they can say whatever is on their mind, and they will not be punished. They will not be judged. They will have somebody meet that with patience and understanding and a conversation. You don't have to tell them they're right, but listening is not going to kill you. And so as we navigate this very difficult time, I would encourage all parents to understand that if you can look at an event and understand that each time there's an event in your child's life, each time there's an event in your life, you're going to build a story around it, and then build better stories around it. Just because somebody doesn't show up at the time when you thought they would doesn't mean that they hate you. That's a common story. And just because somebody doesn't say thank you for a gift you gave them doesn't mean that they didn't appreciate it. It may have slipped their mind. They may have not been raised in a place where gratitude was valued. But we always jump and fill in that story. And if we can teach our kids to not fill in that story, maybe when they get old enough to be a part of the political world or a part of what's happening in the world, they will be better equipped to do it. And they'll be better equipped to say, hey, maybe the best solution here is to listen and to figure out where somebody's coming from, what the pain is, what the traumatic event is, and then sit with it and don't make it about you, and walk on through with somebody without judgment and without ending the relationship. We'll all be better off if we can get to that place. Right now, the world is hurting for a more rational, calm voice and a more patient attitude, and for better stories around events that happen. We don't have to jump to the most negative conclusion. And politics is the one place where you see this happen the most often. And I don't think it's helping anybody. We don't have to assume somebody's intentions. We don't have to assume somebody's beliefs just because of what they said, or maybe they misspoke. Maybe they were in a high-stress environment. And there's a benefit of the doubt that can be given. And as we deal with kids, they're going to navigate different worlds, different rule sets, different circumstances. They're going to deal with constant barrages of other people's behavior. And if they can learn how to narrate better stories around other people's behaviors, they can find a lot of peace and a lot of happiness that maybe we didn't find when we were their age. So give it a try. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Raise 'em Up podcast. Thanks for listening.